I'd like to welcome back our viewers to our conference today, and I'm really pleased to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Julian Agyeman. He is Professor of Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning at Tufts University. He is the originator of the increasingly influential concept of just sustainabilities, the intentional integration of social justice and environmental sustainability. He centers his research on critical exploration of the complex and embedded relations between humans and the urban environment, whether mediated by governments or social movements or social movement organizations, and their effect on public policy and planning processes and outcomes, particularly in relation to the notions of justice and equity. He is the author or editor of 12 books, including Just Sustainabilities, Development in an Unequal World with MIT Press, Cultivating Food Justice, Race, Class, and Sustainability, also MIT, and Sharing Cities, a Case for Truly Smart and Sustainable Cities, published in 2015 by MIT, and considered one of Nature's top 20 books of 2015. In 2018, he was awarded the Athena City Accolade by the KTH Royal Institute of Technology, Stockholm, Sweden, for his outstanding contribution to the field of social justice and ecological sustainability, environmental policy, and planning. As you see, the intersections of his talk are extremely important for today's conference. The title of his talk today is Just Sustainabilities in Policy, Planning, and Practice, and it is my honor to welcome Dr. Agyeman.
Thank you, Professor Mahmoudi, and thank you for the conference planning team for inviting me to speak to this conference. I'd like to open with a land recognition. I'm speaking to you from Cambridge, Massachusetts, on the traditional territory of the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts people, and I'd like to pay my respects, and I'd like us all to pay our respects to their elders, their past, present, and future, and commit to a principle of respect and care as part of this meeting. So let me give you some background on this concept of just sustainabilities. Professor Mahmoudi mentioned the book that kicked it all off, which was called Just Sustainabilities, Development in an Unequal World, which is nearly 20 years ago now. And that was myself, Professor Bullard, the father of environmental justice, and a colleague of mine, Bob Evans, back in the UK. The unique thing about this book, what you'll find, you look at a lot of sustainability books and there is a chapter on equity and justice. And usually they ask me to write that, and I've stopped doing it because I want to see books that focus entirely on equity and justice as the center of the sustainability challenge. So really what this book did 20 years ago, it focused explicitly on equity and justice, on the links between environmental quality and human equality. And in it, we argued that sustainability can't simply be seen as a green issue or an environmental concern, important though those concerns are. What we were arguing was that a truly sustainable society is one where wider questions need to be asked, questions of social need, social welfare, economic opportunity, but that these are integrally linked to environmental limits imposed by supporting ecosystems. Prior to this book, it was really, people were dealing with, social movements were thinking of environmental issues, that was Greenpeace, that was, any of the sort of environmental NGOs, and then the social issues were being left to housing organizations, Amnesty International. Nobody was talking to each other. And one thing that we noticed was, and I want you to think about, wherever in the world environmental degradation is happening, it's almost always happening in relation to human rights abuses or social injustices, whether we're talking about the Amazon, whether we're talking about the Niger Delta, the Kamchatka Peninsula, or rural Australia. Social justice concerns, human rights concerns are always related to environmental degradation. But it wasn't really until this book came out in 2009 that I think we really nailed the social environmental link. What this book did was to look at 40 years of data from across the world, and the headline was basically that it's not poverty that is killing us, literally, it is inequality. And the gap between rich and poor in countries, between nations, is a corrosive factor. And one thing that was really interesting about the book is that they showed that the greater the gap between rich and poor, the more social problems, whether it was teen pregnancy, high school dropout rates, drug abuse, domestic violence, incarceration, you name it. The data showed that the bigger the gap between rich and poor, the more these problems occurred. Countries with a smaller gap had far less of these problems. But what the authors also did was they looked at advertising revenues. You might think that's strange. Why would you look at advertising revenues? Well, this is why. They found that basically countries with the biggest gap between rich and poor spent far more on advertising than countries with a smaller gap. Advertisers love inequality. Inequality sells stuff, and it sells it really quickly. Inequality heightens competitive consumption, keeping up with the Joneses. If you're in a country where there's a massive gap between rich and poor, you're likely to be trapped in a kind of credit squeeze, trying to buy things to get into the next class bracket. And that doesn't just mean the poor into the middle class. That means the middle into the upper middle class, the upper middle into the rich into the super rich into the, oh my God, I'm Jeff Bezos class. It is an escalator of consumption. Now, here's the direct relevance to this conference. That escalator of consumption drives our carbon footprints. Countries with the greatest levels of inequality tend to have the biggest carbon footprints. How often do you hear the climate change crusaders talking about inequality? We're always talking about sustainable transportation, sustainable agriculture, the need for these things. Those are ways of adapting to and mitigating against climate change. We need to look at the drivers, and one of the biggest drivers, it seems to me, is inequality, and we are not really focusing on that. So if we really want to understand sustainability, our focus should be on both human equality and environmental quality together, not separately. And I would argue that we've failed on a lot of environmental causes and a lot of social justice causes because we haven't seen the interlinkages between environmental and social concerns. So in defining just sustainabilities, I think we need to think about ensuring a better quality of life for all now and into the future in a just and equitable manner while living within the limits of supporting ecosystems. And there's 4 conditions here. We must commit to improving people's quality of life and well-being here and across the globe. We must meet the needs of both present and future generations. It's not just about future generations. We need a better quality of life now and into the future. We need to understand justice and equity in terms of recognition, process, procedure, and outcome. Now, procedural justice, process justice, access to decision-making, that's been worked on quite a bit. But I think, and I want you to remember, that the first step in justice has to be the recognition of the right to exist of certain groups. Black Lives Matter is a cry for recognition. Me Too is a cry for recognition. All of the indigenous cries around the world. If we cannot recognize people, then how can we ever have reconciliation or eventually any form of restorative justice in the form of reparations? So think very carefully about that. I think recognition is a precursor to all of the equity and justice claims that we might hear. All of this then has to be done within the 4th condition, living within ecosystem limits. And I just want to make a little shout out here that just sustainabilities thinking underlies and predates Kate Raworth's brilliant work on donut economics, the environmental ceiling, the social foundation, and I am pleased to see that the Sustainable Development Goals, from a very slow start, the UN has now recognized fully, I think, the equity and social justice needs of any credible sustainable development agenda. Now, I want to preface some examples that I'm going to give you in a minute by thinking about 3 overarching issues in urban planning that I think are relevant to this conference. Urban planning, at its simplest, is managing our coexistence in shared space. How do we manage our coexistence in shared space? Whether we're talking about environmental, transport, housing, or other urban issues and conflicts, how do we manage our coexistence in shared space? It would be easy if we all looked alike, thought alike, prayed alike, ate alike, were virtual clones of each other, but we're not. We live in increasing cities of difference. How do we coexist in these shared spaces with people who are very different from us? It's an issue and it's an opportunity. Second point I want you to think about is, what's the relationship between belonging and becoming? In the urban planning world, the sustainability world, the environmental activism world, we're always thinking about, what can this space become? What can this place become? How can we become more resilient, more sharing, more caring, more empathetic, more healthy, more sustainable? But what we're forgetting is, who gets to belong in these cities? How good are we in urban planning, for instance, at recognizing belonging, reconciliation, difference, diversity, inclusion, justice? We are pushing people out of cities, whether they are immigrants, whether they are people who are being displaced as a result of gentrification or xenophobia. Our cities are becoming increasingly elite spaces. Unless we attend to who gets to belong, we will just dream of cities in terms of elite spaces. And finally, I also want you to think about this admonition, certainly in urban planning, and the Congress for New Urbanism is one of the main pushers of this idea of human-scaled planning, human-scale development. That's good, but I want you to put an E on the word human, and I want you to think of humane-scaled. I want dignified planning. I want empathetic planning. I want planning that raises human capabilities. So I'm going to give you 3 examples of just sustainabilities in policy planning and practice. First, spatial justice. How do we allocate rights in urban spaces and places? Second, I want to talk about the Minneapolis Paradox. How does one of the most green, liberal cities in the US end up as the epicenter of our current introspection over structural racism? And I want to then finish up by thinking about food justice. What is local food? This food that we're being told to buy fresh, buy local. What does that mean in an intercultural society? So, social justice requires that life chances are not distributed along class lines. Spatial justice says opportunity, chance should not be distributed geographically. Now, some cities in the world have walls, like East Jerusalem, Nicosia, Belfast in Ireland used to, but we don't need walls in our cities in the US. We have many other marks, such as a creek, a freeway, a zone change, that really differentiates spatially our cities. And when you think about it, you probably grew up in a town where on one side of the tracks they lived and on the other side you lived, and their life chances, their life opportunities, their life expectancy could vary greatly. Indeed, a study by Harvard University said it may be that your zip code is more important than your genetic code in your life chances, opportunities, and indeed life span. So let me just bring spatial justice down to a very basic level and think about the streets, the public space that we all use every day. Here's 2 streets. On the left, Södervägen in Gothenburg, Sweden. On the right, Massachusetts Avenue, Cambridge, near where I live. What is the right to space in these places? If you look at Massachusetts Avenue, clearly the American view of rights in public space is basically having a vehicle and then the size of your vehicle. Whereas the Swedes, on the other side, have structured urban space in a way that nobody is privileged over anybody else. The streetcar, the ability to cycle, the ability to walk. To the left of the streetcar, you can see that there's a fence. To the left of that fence, that's the only part of the street that private vehicles can use. The Swedes have imposed spatial justice on the street. They have democratized the street. And I want to ask you a question, and I don't have the answer to this, but I think something you might want to think about. Imagine you're a kid growing up for the first 16 years of your life on these two streets. How are you wired differently? How do you think differently? I am sure that if you came out onto Södervägen, you must have a much more peaceful affect, a much more peaceful sort of notion of space than coming out onto Massachusetts Avenue and seeing this basically organized chaos. Think about that. Now, we do have some data. We know that basically street traffic affects social interactions on streets, and the heavily trafficked street, as you can see, has much less interactions between people than the lightly trafficked street. Now, you might think, well, where's he going with this? Well, here's where I'm going. Just Sustainabilities says, well, that heavily trafficked street, we know from the data, is mainly in low income and people of colour neighbourhoods. And the lightly trafficked street, traffic calmed, benches, bump outs, trees, that street is largely in more tony, white, middle class neighbourhoods. That's the importance of spatial justice thinking. Now, look, good news from New York. In the Bloomberg administration, we started to get some incredible experiments on making streets people streets, making Times Square a people square. We can do this. Who would have thought that we could do this in somewhere like New York? And for me, there's a very important point here. Good urban planning, good sustainability should not be about what we've always done. It should be about what is possible. It shouldn't be about what is probable. Oh, we've probably always done it that way. That's what we'll do now. Urban planning, sustainability should be about what is possible. Only by dreaming of these possibilities can we get to a more equitable and just city. Now, I mentioned we're very good at disbelonging, at showing people they don't belong, whether it's on the top left, putting little studs on ledges to stop teenage boys and girls from skateboarding, whether it's putting armrests on benches to stop homeless people sleeping on them. Even more egregiously, it could be putting studs, architects putting studs on covered spaces so that homeless people can't sleep on them. Even whole buildings can have separate doors for the rich and the poor. And this happens in London, Vancouver, New York, all over the world. These are egregious and horrific abuses of architecture and urban design in the name of pushing out people who are deemed not welcome. Bottom left is a very interesting case. That's a bridge in Seattle, and the city has a huge homelessness problem, and they decided to put bike racks under the bridge to stop homeless people sleeping there. And kudos to the Seattle biking community. They said, hey, we have a problem with homelessness, big problem, yes, but we're not going to use sustainability or biking infrastructure to alleviate this problem. Take those down, and thankfully the city did. But it shows how cynical a progressive city like Seattle can be, using sustainability infrastructure to get rid of homeless people. And they've done it with parks as well. They've argued that homeless people are destroying the ecology of parks, so they've used ecological and sustainability arguments to move homeless people on. Cynical and not helpful in the least. One very helpful concept, I feel, is Elijah Anderson of Yale University's concept of the cosmopolitan canopy. His point is, most of the time we're walking down streets and we studiously avoid other people's eyes. We don't want to look at people. But he said there's certain places in cities, and in Philadelphia he names the Reading Terminal Market as an example of what he calls a cosmopolitan canopy, a place where people sit down, they eat different cultural foods, they maybe watch a ball game, they start talking to each other across difference. These spaces are very important. And being in the planning urban design field, I wonder, can we create cosmopolitan canopies, or do they just develop organically? Children's spaces like this, food spaces, these are great cosmopolitan opportunities. Two concepts I want you to think of here. Number one, contact theory. Contact theory says the more contact we have in non-structured situations with people who are different to us, then we are likely to be much more tolerant and accepting of difference and actually seeking out difference and diversity. Second is, don't think contact theory cosmopolitan canopies are going to get rid of racism. They're not. But they are places where we can speak across difference. They are spaces of engagement where people can begin at their level to meet across difference. Very important. One of the urban design approaches to spatial injustice is the idea of complete streets. Every city, your city, my city, every city has a complete streets design guide, very much a physical urban design guide, usually by experts, and it's a way of changing our streets to deprioritize private vehicular use and to reprioritize the cyclist, the pedestrian, the so-called active transportation, and obviously public transit as well. But one of the problems with this urban design approach is it sees streets as a physical design challenge rather than social construct. And I've put here two designs. I mean, one on the right is what an urban designer might look at and think of as a complete street. And then on the left is, of course, a complete street. That's in Athens, Greece. We can't design that street. I mean, yes, the physical street has been designed, but the social processes, the social ecology of that street is something I think urban designers need to think about. So Doreen Massey sees places, and streets are places, as constantly shifting articulations of social relations through time. But most of our currently physically oriented urban design practice disconnects these streets from significant social, structural, symbolic, discursive, and other historical realities. And, you know, to really bring this home, Los Angeles has a complete streets plan. Would you believe that? And they're doing some great work. But until very recently, they banned, made illegal street vending. How do you, in a city that has a huge Latinx population, that has a huge Southeast Asian population, whose cultures are focused around street food, how do you say we have a complete streets policy, yet we won't allow these groups to do what their cultures have had them do for thousands of years? Again, we need to think critically. This is why I'm a critical urban planner. I don't disagree with complete streets policies, but who gets to say what a complete street is? Were these Latinx people, were these Southeast Asian people consulted on what a complete street is? Because they wouldn't say, hey, we shouldn't have our cultural rights on the street. The good news is LA reversed their policy, and now food vending, street food vending, can be permitted. One of the problems, though, with this idea of complete streets, these green neighborhoods, if you like, is that they do cause gentrification. This is part of a book series that I edit. My book was called Incomplete Streets, Processes, Practices, and Possibilities, the one on the left. And really, again, calling into question, not the concept of complete streets, but the implementation, the envisioning of what a complete street is. Just Green Enough, Green Gentrification. The book on the right argues that basically greening whitens neighborhoods. The greener the neighborhood, the whiter the neighborhood. We all know about redlining. We know that redlining was a racist, intentional policy that deprived certain neighborhoods, largely Black and people of color neighborhoods, of government and private funding. Greenlining isn't racist. It's a socioeconomic thing. It costs to live in a nice, green, complete streets neighborhood. But socioeconomics in the US is so closely tied to race that greener neighborhoods look like whiter neighborhoods. Greenlining and redlining are linked, but not through intent, but through outcome. So one of my worries, and the worry of the book series, is that while we agree with the concept of complete streets, we think that these policies, plans, and efforts are systematically reproducing many of the urban, spatial, and social inequalities and injustices that have characterized our cities for the last century or more. And, you know, to just nail this home, I like to really push a point with you. This is one of the apps that you can measure walkability. Now, I would argue walkability is one of the key urban sustainability metrics. The more walkable your neighborhood, the nicer your neighborhood is, quite frankly. And WalkScore is that app. Guess who owns the app? It's Redfin, the massive online realty company. So let's just take stock here. We have compromised and commodified sustainability so that now in the US, sustainability, sustainable neighborhoods are something you buy into. I want everybody to have a sustainable neighborhood. It should not be based on ability to pay. We think of parks as well. Many of our parks were designed about 150 years ago or more, when communities look very different. How are our parks designed today? How can we design, manage, and program parks, or co-design, co-manage, and co-program parks with communities? That would be the way forward. Imagine how a park would be used, how much better it would be for the community if it were co-designed, co-managed, and co-programmed. But that doesn't usually happen in our park systems. But that is certainly something that I'm talking to several municipalities about. And that idea, I think, is something that you might want to think about for the future. There was an excellent report in Boston about nearly 20 years ago now on immigrant engagement in public open spaces, strategies for the new Boston. And, you know, we're about to have a momentous thing happen in Boston. We have a mayoral election coming up in this month and the final runoff in November. 5 candidates, all people of color, 4 of them are women. We are going to have a mayor of color, the first mayor of color in Boston. And it makes this really interesting. The city has changed, but yet the friends of the park organizations are still resolutely white, upper middle class, rich. They're the ones who got the money. I'm not blaming them. This is not a blame game here. But how does that figure? How does this old school friends of setup figure against a new set of administrations who are going to be progressive liberal, who are going to perhaps want to make changes? How does the politics of all of this work? And I think it's, again, there's no answer to it, but I think it's a question we need to raise. But, you know, we can look to the immigrants themselves. How are they using public spaces? I love this quote. I think one of the reasons that that place is so popular with us Latinos is because of the willows. Willows in Guatemala are very common. They grow beside rivers. People like Herta Park on the River Charles in Boston because it looks like home. Immigrants are voting with their feet. They're going to places that are redolent of their home countries. I call this landscape links. People want to be in a place that's familiar, and I'm going to come back to that. Now in Copenhagen, Denmark, Superkilen Park, they've tried to encourage engagement and belonging through design, designing in encounter. The Nørrebro neighborhood in Copenhagen is a very diverse immigrant neighborhood. And as you can see here, it's a linear park. The park is in 3 parts. And the idea was to get the community to suggest artifacts that could be put in the park that would be representative of their cultures. So when you go there, and I've been there, it's like walking through a living museum. All of the artifacts represent something to different cultures. People learn about each other's cultures through the artifacts, asking each other, oh, what does that mean? What's this thing? So that's another approach to belonging. But I've got to say, the work that I am most impressed with is the work of my good friends at the Department of Landscape at the University of Sheffield in England, who have formed the Transnational Urban Outdoors Research Group. They are doing deep ethnographies. They are helping communities produce ethnographies, which can then be used by planners and decision makers. This idea of co-producing ethnographies of communities, I think is a great idea. Because at the moment, what do we use in urban planning? We look at the demographics, which gives you a percentage of Latinx, African American, Asian American, white, etc. What does that tell us? It just gives us a body count, if you like. But deep ethnographies drill down into the culture, the sociopolitics of each community. They've done some fantastic work on refugees and parks, because if you think about the trauma suffered by refugees and asylum seekers, they need good quality public spaces. This group has been working on looking at what might parks look like if it were responsible to trauma and traumatized victims. They've produced a fantastic article, Ethnographic Understandings of Ethnically Diverse Neighborhoods to Inform Urban Design Practice. We know how to do this. This isn't rocket science, but we're not doing it nearly enough. I want to see more of it happening. So the second example was this Minneapolis Paradox. Urban planning is a tool of white supremacy. There's no accident about why things happen in American cities. It's largely predictable, and it's largely at root, I believe, through urban planning. Let's think about this. So on the surface, Minneapolis is a fantastic city. It's green. It's up there with Portland, Oregon. It's got the best park system. It's got one of the best cities for exercise. It's got the third most bike commuters. It's affordable. It's got opportunity. It's got wealth. It's a great place if you're white. If you're not white, it's not such a great place. Racial inequality is among the worst in the nation. The black-white income gap is one of the highest. But more tellingly, the wealth gap, the black-white home ownership gap, is the highest in the nation. The opportunity or achievement gap in schools is highest between Native American and white and African American and white people. So you have an unjust sustainability. You've got a green city that is desperately unequal. And this is, a cautionary tale. Do not think that just greening our cities, making them more environmentally friendly, will make them more socially just. It won't. In fact, Minneapolis is the case study about that. So I decided to try and find out, why is this so? And Kirsten Delegard, who is a historian in Minneapolis, she said all that civic rhetoric about Minneapolis being a model metropolis at the cutting edge of great urban planning obscures darker truths about the city. What are those darker truths? Well, prior to 1900, Minneapolis had a small but dispersed population of African Americans. And then in the early 1900s, racialized covenants were starting to be used in rental and home sales. This home cannot be rented, sold, or otherwise let to anyone other than members of the Caucasian race. And these covenants had the effect of then concentrating the African American community in North Minneapolis, where it still largely is today. If that wasn't bad enough, we had then racist zoning, which was outlawed in 1917 by the Supreme Court, but it was replaced by single-family zoning. Single-family zoning, not racist, it's socioeconomic, but again, socioeconomics, proxy for race. Single-family zoning means largely white neighborhoods, and that is 70% of the land in Minneapolis. On top of that, then, redlining, the denial of home loans and home equity lines from private sector and government sources in certain D neighborhoods deemed hazardous. So each one of these racialized covenants, single family zoning, redlining, was pretty effective. Cumulatively, they are super effective. And the net effect is racial segregation then and now. Only one country did it better than us, and that was apartheid South Africa with the Group Areas Act. It is recognized by the current progressive city council in Minneapolis that those practices have a lot of, well, those practices are the result of, white supremacist thinking, and they have had an effect on where the city is today. And as I say, urban planning is the spatial toolkit of articulating, implementing, and maintaining white supremacy, and we can do something about it. And if I had longer, I would go into this. It is undeniable that urban planning, not necessarily urban planners, but the pantheon, the foundations of urban planning, certainly in the United States, were about segregation and denial of opportunity. Minneapolis is trying to do something about it. The Minneapolis 2040 plan talks about eliminating disparities. It talks about affordable and accessible housing. The city was the first large city in the US in 2018 to abandon single-family zoning, and they now allow duplexes and triplexes on former single-family zoned land. They have an inclusionary zoning policy with affordable housing as a priority. And if you go through the document, and I would strongly urge you, there are 39 policies related to this goal of eliminating disparities. And one of them, if you see, number 48, is freeway remediation. I wonder whether President Biden and Secretary Buttigieg got their idea from this, but freeways are racist infrastructures. They were deliberately built to bust up people of color and low-income communities. So eliminating disparities, lots of policies there. Let's see how Minneapolis does. So my final example is this idea of food justice. And I want to start with a story. 10 years ago now, I was listening to a segment on NPR, and it was an interview with George and Julia Bowling from the Bowling Farm in Maryland. And they said, look, we've been, the state of Maryland has been trying to get people out of tobacco farming for a long time. We need to diversify. We need to think about a new crop or new crops, and we need to think about a new market. And so they, being good American entrepreneurs, decided to look around, and they realized that there's about 120,000 Africans living in the DC area who want to eat African food. They don't want it flown in, they want fresh African food. And these are relatively wealthy people. They are professors, they are surgeons, they are diplomats, policymakers, etc. So the Africans want to eat African food grown in Maryland. And the Bowlings worked with the Extension Service at the University of Maryland and came up with a sort of guide to what African crops can grow in the Maryland climate, Maryland soils. And now the signboard to the Bowling Farm is on the left, African produce. People drive out from DC and come and collect stuff and then go back. What are local foods in an intercultural society? If you talk to many of the foodies, the denizens of the farmers market, they'll tell you, oh, it's got to be, it's local food, it's indigenous food, it's food that has always grown here. Well, Native Americans might actually disagree, but the Africans see their food as local food. Now, here's the deal. What is local? I'm a geographer. There is no such concept. Local is a relational relative term. What the Africans are doing is redefining local as a cultural local. They want to eat their foods grown locally. Is there anything wrong with that? Similarly, in San Diego, Filipino immigrants see Filipino food that they grow in the yards, that they eat in their restaurants. They see that as local food. So the idea, I think, that I want to put forward is this notion of translocalism, that immigrants bring with them their own local, and it's a cultural local. Just as the Guatemalan who talks about the willows, he is bringing his local with him, and he is making it on the shores of the River Charles in Boston. In Metro Vancouver, Canada, believe it or not, nearly 20% of farmers in Metro Vancouver are Chinese Canadians. And this is an example here of one of their farms. You'll note the extended home, often multi-generational homes. The Chinese and a lot of Southeast Asian communities have this great idea of multi-generational living. But the point I'm going to make here, though, is that the Chinese don't use the main economic locus of the alternative food movement, which is the farmers market. The Chinese have set their own farmers markets up in parallel to the largely white middle-class Vancouverites who go to other farmers markets. And I gave this talk in Vancouver about 10 years ago, and an East African woman who's recently immigrated to Vancouver came up to me and said, Julian, I'm so glad you said this. I shop at the Chinese farmers markets because they grow the food I want to grow. What I'm doing here is destabilizing conventional narratives about buy fresh, buy local. Because whenever we see these signs, buy fresh, buy local, we never see cultural or ethnically relevant crops. We always see Euro standardized crops. We never see black and brown bodies in these buy fresh, buy local imaginaries. We see very much an imaginary of a past America, an America of the past. I don't see America of the present or America in the future in much of this kind of advertising. In South Central LA, there was South Central Farm, a fantastic, the biggest urban farm in the United States. 95% of the farmers were Latin American, Latinx people. And I get a bristle down my neck when I read this quote from these two women, and you can see them there in their garden. I planted this garden because it's a little space like home. We grow the same plants that I had back in my garden in Oaxaca. We can eat like we ate at home, and this makes us feel like ourselves. It allows us to keep a part of who we are after coming to the United States. The Africans in DC, the Guatemalans in Boston, the Latin Americans in LA are creating home. They are creating a space that has meaning. It doesn't mean to say they don't want to be Americans. Of course they do, but they want a sanctuary. And I think this is what's really important about this. And we can do this through food. They are creating a space through food. So that garden, they're not just growing culturally relevant foods, they are growing them in the same way. The garden is laid out as it was. It's a sanctuary, it's a space. And I want to just throw in a political comment here. Some people might think that, you know, that this is not American or whatever. This is American. This is allowing people the freedom to express their cultural desires in a way that sustains and nourishes them and helps them develop and care for their own well-being. I was recently in San Diego and I visited New Roots Farm. And this is a farm where 85 growers from 12 countries, you know, it's one of 50 farms around the country, these refugee farms. And we've got one here in Lowell, Massachusetts, which is partly run by Tufts University. These are spaces where these immigrants and refugees can come and get a first footing in US agriculture. They're also intercultural learning spaces. The other farmers might be from Latin America, they might be from Poland, they might be from Tigray and Ethiopia. Imagine the intercultural learning possibilities that can happen at these 50 farms that are dotted around the country and actually are mainly funded by the IRC. I just have to finish up by giving a little plug for my latest book, The Immigrant Food Nexus, Borders, Labor and Identity in North America. Really, what this book is looking at is we can't talk about immigration policy without talking about food. 70% of workers in the food chain, from the fields to restaurants or the production processes, are immigrants, and most of them are undocumented. We've always used cheap labor in our food system, whether it was slavery or this modern slavery. That's the way we've used food. And many people say, oh, the food system is broken. No, it's not. It's working exactly as it was intended to. Exploitative, demanding precarity and insecurity from the workers. And after the slaves, it was the Latin Americans. And who will it be next that is the mainstay of our food system? But the book is a hopeful book because the stories in this book also talk of those Mexican-American women in the Southwest who are setting up cooperatives so that their husbands working in the fields can sell food through the cooperative, sustaining larger communities. So really, really important work if you're interested in that kind of stuff. So let me just summarize. We need to think about managing our coexistence in shared space. We need to foster belonging as well as what cities can become. We need to foster engagement using deep ethnography. We can't just use simple demographic data. That doesn't tell us anything other than proportions of bodies, of color or whiteness, whatever, different cultures. We need deep ethnographies. We need to understand communities, and we can co-produce these between local government and local community. We need to engage in intercultural, culturally competent planning and policy making. And we need to practice humane-scaled and human-scaled urban planning and design. But above all, I want to leave you with the note that social justice never simply happens in planning processes, in sustainability. We must be intentional, implicit, and front and center with social justice. I don't think we get to social justice. I think we have to start with social justice in policy making and planning. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Agyeman, for that very informative talk, and especially focusing us on the justice aspect of sustainability, not only in policy, but in planning and practice. You've given us some very helpful examples from various regions of the country and even Canada. So I would now like to ask our audience to please pose your questions. This is the time to do so. Kate, do you have a question or?
I do, and maybe that will give people time to type, as all I know sometimes typing can take a couple of minutes. So my question is, how do we make sure that social justice becomes the focus in these urban planning environments? So how do we make sure that people have access to these processes to be able to give feedback, to make sure that these spaces are being designed to be more inclusive?
Yeah, I mean, great question. And there's a couple of different ways of thinking about this. Imagine who is doing the urban planning and urban designing. Do those people look like the communities that they're serving? And in general, the answer is no. So it behooves us in urban planning schools, accredited urban planning schools. And as you know, Kate, I'm heading to my orientation in about 15, 20 minutes for the new crop. We have a bumper crop. It's more diverse than ever. We are intentional at Tufts at trying to bring in a more diverse group of people into what are called the city building professions, because we believe, I mean, it's not a certainty, but we believe that if the profession looks different, the response of communities will be slightly different as well. Second, as I mentioned in my very final point, we need to center social justice and equity concerns. My next book is going to be on climate adaptation. You know that many cities started climate adaptation plans 10, 15 years ago. But now, with the new focus on equity and social justice post George Floyd murder, there is cities are now, Austin's doing it, Minneapolis, trying to retrofit equity and social justice, because many of those climate adaptation plans and climate mitigation plans were race neutral. They were kind of, oh, let's make our city resilient. But we know which parts of the city are most liable to extreme heat. Vivek Chandas at Portland State did that fantastic work looking at how formerly redlined neighborhoods are the most hot because they've got least trees and they've got most sort of dark tarmac spaces, if you like. We can look all around the urban planning world and see that in most decisions, there was no centering of equity and social justice. Again, only when we center equity and social justice will we have more equitable and socially just outcomes. So diversifying the profession, really becoming intentional and mindful about social justice and equity, and, you know, looking at examples from around the world of where this has been done. And, you know, again, I don't want to take up all the time, but one city that I would ask you to look at is Belo Horizonte in Brazil. This is the city that Francis Moore Latte, the food writer, called the city that abolished hunger. How did they do it? In the early 1990s, a new administration, Socialist Worker Party, came in. You know, Brazil is a capitalist nation, so this is not, you know, happening under a communist regime. What the city did in 1992 was to bring all food-related functions under one directorate. They tasked the directorate with centering social justice, food with dignity, and the Brazilian constitutional right to food. And that's where they built the whole platform. And now they have one of the world's most sophisticated food security systems. And get this, and I'll leave it at this, the city sets the price. The city fixes the price of certain essential foodstuffs if you're on benefits. So private sector retailers have to sell at that price. They can sell to non-benefits recipients at whatever price the market will hold. But imagine a city fixing the price of certain foods. But it's worked. And I'm very pleased to say also that one of the candidates for mayor of Boston, Councillor Wu, Michelle Wu, has a food justice agenda for a resilient Boston. And she comes very close, not in terms of price fixing, but she opens this by saying food justice is racial justice. We need to decenter whiteness in local food systems. Boom. That's a great start to centering social justice as a foundation of food policy and planning.
Thank you. From Connie Siebold, could you speak to whether there is a connection between acculturative stress and the immigrant community nexus, particularly in a how to best engage them where they are sort of way?
Accumulative stress, sorry, was that what you said?
Acculturative.
Oh, right. It's not a term I'm absolutely familiar with, but sorry, carry on.
No, that's, I think, basically whether there is a connection between the acculturative stress and the immigrant community nexus. So how to best engage the community?
Well, I think there's great examples around North America. I mean, the Canadians are pretty good at this, but then again, you see, Canadians don't talk about immigrants, they talk about new Canadians. You know, it's a very, very important point. Narrative words are really important. Welcome new Canadians or welcome immigrants. I mean, to be thought of as a new Canadian, a new American, I think that's a very important thing. So the Canadians have set up this concept of welcoming communities where they have hosts who will help people. The Canadians also have, and we do have here in the US as well, a lot of immigrant food kitchens where, you know, immigrants will help I was going to use the word indigenous, but I don't mean indigenous, already settled people understand different cuisines from around the world. And in Toronto, I know that there's a couple of very impressive Syrian sort of food kitchens where Syrian women will prepare food, help other communities. So there's sites of intercultural exchange. So I think there's lots of examples, not just through food, but through, you know, where design features, like in Copenhagen, the idea of designing spaces with immigrant groups, I think is really important. So it's about, I think, ethnographic understanding, but again, it's about centering issues of social justice and the freedom of community expression.
Thank you. I think Dr. Daggett has the next question.
Thank you for this talk. I think that Dr. Seaman mentioned how at the end of my talk, I was referencing some things about streets and urban planning, which I work in energy politics. And so it really sparked a lot in me. And a question I had is actually related, I think, to the one in the Q&A, which is centering justice as we are all here doing, and the way that this, I think, kind of demands a reorganization of capitalism and a lot of big structural issues that you mentioned around labor and wages. So I wondered two related questions. One, how does fighting capitalism or these bigger economic restructuring issues come into urban planning? Like, does this get discussed and batted around in these kind of design meetings or planning meetings? And the second one is, do you have your own theory of change, of the way that urban planning or spatial justice might be one dimension of kind of getting to these bigger structural changes?
So two very simple questions that can be answered in 30 seconds. Thank you, Professor Daggett. Look, I mean, I could spend my 50 minutes talking about the kind of the critique of capital that is needed to install just sustainabilities. But what I prefer to do is look at on the ground examples, as I've done. But inherent in what I'm talking about is, yes, absolutely a need. You know, I did some work recently with a friend of mine in a colleague at Tufts, and we looked at the emerging alternative food ecosystem in Boston. There's a whole range of nonprofits who are doing very similar work, food nonprofits, and who kind of interact with each other almost in a network. And it's almost as if there's an emerging local food economy. They're all predicated on issues of social justice. They're all predicated on issues of hiring local people. And this is a low-income minority neighborhood, Dorchester, Roxbury in Boston. They all link in various other ways, but they don't have like an overall sort of coordinating committee. So it's very ad hoc. And we were suggesting, what if there was some sort of overall coordinating committee? Because we reckon there's 250 to 350 people employed in this, that it is a real alternative economic food production model in what is called, quote unquote, a food desert. So we have lots of examples, I think, through cooperativism, through sort of new economic arrangements. We have those. Are they immediately challenging capitalism? No, they're not. But you know, we do have, I think, lots of possibilities that could be scaled up, out, and scaled down as well, drilled down right into communities. And I've forgotten the second part, which was, oh, no, so that was the second part. The first part, look, it depends, and I hate to use the word woke, it depends if the planner, the urban designer has these things, you know, in his, her, or their minds, whether, you know, the urban design is more related to the community or whether it's a cookie cutter design from a design manual. And you know, we're going through a similar process at Tufts. We've, you know, the president has pledged Tufts will become an anti-racist institution within 5 years, has put 25 million into it. One point I've made is we can't leave it to champions like me and the 10 or 20 other faculty that are really pushing these issues. You know, champions are needed, but this needs to come across the faculty, staff, alumni. Similarly, in the planning profession, as in any profession, there are champions of these ideas. How do we mainstream these ideas? That's the key, I think. And I think what we desperately in need of is some big city, large scale success stories. And this is why I am so hopeful, and I'm going to put it out there, that the Councillor Michelle Wu wins the Boston mayoral election. She has the vision. She is weaving a new narrative, and this is, I think, really important. You know, when I was before I came to Boston, I lived in London, and you know, if somebody had said Boston to me, I'd have thought Boston Tea Party, Red Sox, and Cheers. That's not what Boston's about. We need a new narrative, and I think that we need progressive mayors to reweave these narratives. We need community infusion into these narratives, and once we start a new narrative that doesn't disregard, you know, the Tea Party or the Red Sox or Cheers, but brings in these new stories that are now part of what makes Boston a great city. So these are cultural changes, I think, Cara, as well as economic changes. And I think we need the cultural changes in many ways to drive new ways of economic thinking.
Thank you. So we have about a minute left. We have one question left. So I'm going to see if we can do that in the last minute. So this is from Hugh Pocock, who says, as you have outlined, social justice requires radical change of capitalist practice. Greening requires massive public-private investment. How do we bring these two seemingly disparate dynamics together?
And could you just say that once more, the first bit? Sorry.
So as you have outlined, social justice requires radical change of capitalist practice, and greening requires massive public-private investment. How do we bring these two seemingly disparate dynamics together?
Yeah, a great question. And, you know, in the 15, 20, 30 seconds I've got, well, let me give you an example of how not to do it. I mean, there's a case study from East Boston, which is near the airport, a largely Latinx community, but heavily gentrified community now. It's very much the most prone to climate impacts in Boston, and it's low income and it's minority. What the city's done, though, is work with private developers to develop condos, which are completely resilient, you know, and up to code now on height, in terms of height above ground. They've built these on berms. Anyway, the city put money in as well. So these condos and the people that live there, largely white, upper middle class, are resilient. But what's happened is that the research has shown that these condos will make climate impacts even worse, certainly inundation impacts along the East Boston coastline. And that all of the, you know, the restorative work, the climate adaptation work is really geared around helping these condos survive, but not the community. So that's, you know, that's just not social justice, but it's the private sector and the city council in cahoots doing what they think is good in creating more resilience, but resilience for who? Again, this is not something we can just answer, but again, I would say we do need examples of cities with bold mayors, with bold visions, who can start to really look at, you know, how do we mitigate against huge climate impacts for everybody, especially those who are most disadvantaged. So Hugh, no simple answer. We know we've got to do it, and let's look around and see what the opportunities are.
Thank you so much, Professor Agyeman, for your presentation and for answering the questions. And we appreciate very much your taking the time out of your very busy schedule to join us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.